Section 19 of On War. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. On War by Carl von Clausewitz. Translated by Colonel J. J. Graham. Book 4, Chapter 1. Introductory. Having in the foregoing book examined the subjects which may be regarded as the efficient elements of war, we shall now turn our attention to the combat as the real activity in warfare, which, by its physical and moral effects, embraces sometimes more simply, sometimes in a more complex manner, the object of the whole campaign. In this activity and in its effects, these elements must therefore appear. The formation of the combat is tactical in its nature. We only glance at it here in a general way in order to get acquainted with its aspect as a whole. In practice, the minor or more immediate objects give every combat a characteristic form. These objects we shall not discuss until hereafter, but these peculiarities are in comparison to the general characteristics of a combat mostly only insignificant, so that most combats are very like one another, and therefore, in order to avoid repeating that which is general at every stage, we are compelled to look into it here before taking up the subject of its more special applications. In the first place, therefore, we shall give in the next chapter, in a few words, the characteristics of the modern battle in its tactical course, because that lies at the foundation of our conception of what the battle really is. Chapter 2. Character of the Modern Battle. According to the notion we have formed of tactics and strategies, it follows, as a matter of course, that if the nature of the former is changed, that change must have an influence on the latter. If tactical facts in one case are entirely different from those in another, then the strategic must be also, if they are to continue consistent and reasonable. It is therefore important to characterise a general action in its modern form before we advance with the study of its employment in strategy. What do we do now usually in a great battle? We place ourselves quietly in great masses, arranged contiguous to and behind one another. We deploy relatively only a small portion of the whole, and let it ring itself out in a fire combat which lasts for several hours, only interrupted now and again, and removed hither and thither, by separate small shocks from charges with the bayonet and cavalry attacks. When this line has gradually exhausted part of its warlike ardour in this manner, and there remains nothing more than the cinders, it is withdrawn and replaced by another. In this manner, the battle on a modified principle burns slowly away like wet powder, and if the veil of night commands it to stop, because neither party can any longer see, and neither chooses to run the risk of blind chance, then an account is taken by each side respectively of the masses remaining, which can be called still effective, that is, which are not yet quite collapsed like extinct volcanoes. Account is taken of the ground gained or lost, and of how stands the security of the rear. These results, with the special impressions as to bravery and cowardice, ability and stupidity, which are thought to have been observed in ourselves and in the enemy, are collected into one single total impression, out of which there springs the resolution to quit the field, or to renew the combat on the morrow. This description, which is not intended as a finished picture of a modern battle, but only to give its general tone, suits for the offensive and defensive, and the special traits which are given by the object proposed, the country, and such, may be introduced to it without materially altering the conception. But modern battles are not so by accident. They are so because the parties find themselves nearly on a level as regards military organisation and the knowledge of the art of war, and because the warlike element inflamed by the general national interests has broken through the artificial limits and now flows in its natural channel. Under these two conditions, battles will always preserve this character. This general idea of the modern battle will be useful to us in sequel in more places than one, if we want to estimate the value of the particular coefficients of strength, country, and such. It is only for general, great, and decisive combats, and such as come near to them, that this description stands good. Inferior ones have changed their character also in the same direction, but less than great ones. The proof of this belongs to tactics. We shall, however, have an opportunity hereafter of making this subject plainer by giving a few particulars. Chapter 3. The Combat in General. The combat is the real warlike activity. everything else is only its auxiliary. Let us therefore take an attentive look at its nature. Combat means fighting, and in this the destruction or conquest of the enemy is the object, and the enemy, in the particular combat, is the armed force which stands opposed to us. This is the simple idea. We shall return to it, but before we can do that, we must insert a series of others. If we suppose the State and its military force as a unit, then the most natural idea is to imagine the war also as one great combat, and in the simple relations of savage nations it is also not much otherwise. But our wars are made up of a number of great and small simultaneous or consecutive combats, and this severance of activity into so many separate actions is owing to the great multiplicity of the relations out of which war arises with us. In point of fact, the ultimate object of our wars, the political one, is not always quite a simple one, and even were it so, still the action is bound up with such a number of conditions and considerations to be taken into account, that the object can no longer be attained by one single great act, but only through a number of greater or smaller acts which are bound up into a whole. Each of these separate acts is therefore a part of a whole, and has consequently a special object by which it is bound to this whole. We have already said that every strategic act can be referred to the idea of a combat, because it is an employment of the military force, and at the root of that there always lies the idea of fighting. We may therefore reduce every military activity in the province of strategy to the unit of the single combats, and occupy ourselves with the object of these only. We shall get acquainted with these special objects by degrees, as we come to speak of the causes which produce them. Here let us content ourselves with saying that every combat, great or small, has its own peculiar object in subordination to the main object. If this is the case, then the destruction and conquest of the enemy is only to be regarded as the means of gaining this object, as it unquestionably is. But this result is true only in its form, and important only on account of the connection which the ideas have between themselves, and we have only sought it out to get rid of it at once. What is overcoming the enemy? Invariably the destruction of his military force, whether it be by death or wounds or any means, whether it be completely or only to such a degree that he can no longer continue the contest. Therefore, as long as we set aside all special objects of combats, we may look upon the complete or partial destruction of the enemy as the only object for all combats. Now we maintain that in the majority of cases, and especially in great battles, the special object by which the battle is individualised and bound up with the great whole is only a weak modification of that general object, or an ancillary object bound up with it, important enough to individualise the battle, but always insignificant in comparison with the general object, so that if that ancillary object alone should be obtained, only an unimportant part of the purpose of the combat is fulfilled. If this assertion is correct, then we see that the idea, according to which the destruction of the enemy's force is only the means, and something else always the object, can only be true in form, but that it would lead to false conclusions if we did not recollect that this destruction of the enemy's force is comprised in that object, and that this object is only a weak modification of it. Forgetfulness of this led to completely false views before the wars of the last period, and created tendencies, as well as fragments of systems, in which theory thought it raised itself so much the more above handcraft, the less it supposed itself to stand in need of the use of the real instrument, that is, the destruction of the enemy's force. Certainly such a system could not have arisen unless supported by other false suppositions, and unless in place of the destruction of the enemy, other things had been substituted to which an efficacy was ascribed which did not rightly belong to them. We shall attack these falsehoods whenever occasion requires, but we could not treat of the combat without claiming for it the real importance and value which belong to it, and giving warning against the errors to which merely formal truth might lead. But now how shall we manage to show that in most cases, and in those of most importance, the destruction of the enemy's army is the chief thing? How shall we manage to combat the extremely subtle idea which supposes it possible, through the use of a special artificial form to effect by a small direct destruction of the enemy's forces a much greater destruction indirectly, or by means of small but extremely well directed blows to produce such paralysis in the enemy's forces, such command over the enemy's will, that this mode of proceeding is to be viewed as a great shortening of the road. Undoubtedly a victory at one point may be of more value than at another. Undoubtedly there is a scientific arrangement of battles amongst themselves, even in strategy, which is in fact nothing but the art of thus arranging them. To deny that is not our intention, but we assert that the direct destruction of the enemy's forces is everywhere predominant. We contend here for the overruling importance of this destructive principle, and nothing else. We must, however, call to mind that we are now engaged with strategy, not tactics. Therefore we do not speak of the means which the former have of destroying at a small expense a large body of the enemy's forces, but under direct destruction we understand the tactical results, and that therefore our assertion is that only great tactical results can lead to great strategical ones, or, as we have already once before more distinctly expressed it, the tactical successes are of paramount importance in the conduct of war. The proof of this assertion seems to us simple enough. It lies in the time which every complicated, artificial, combination requires. The question whether a simple attack, or one or more carefully prepared, that is, more artificial, will produce greater effects, may undoubtedly be decided in favour of the latter, as long as the enemy is assumed to remain quite passive. But every carefully combined attack requires time for its preparation, and if a counterstroke by the enemy intervenes, our whole design may be upset. Now if the enemy should decide upon some simple attack, which can be executed in a shorter time, then he gains the initiative and destroys the effect of the great plan. Therefore, together with the expediency of a complicated attack, we must consider all the dangers which we run during its preparation, and should only adopt it if there is no reason to fear that the enemy will disconcert our scheme. Whenever this is the case, we must ourselves choose the simpler, that is, quicker way, and lower our views in this sense as far as the character, the relations of the enemy, and other circumstances may render necessary. If we quit the weak impressions of abstract ideas and descend to the region of practical life, then it is evident that a bold, courageous, resolute enemy will not let us have time for wide-reaching, skilful combinations, and it is just against such a one we should require skill the most. By this it appears to us that the advantage of simple and direct results over those that are complicated is conclusively shown. Our opinion is not on that account that the simple blow is the best, but that we must not lift the arm too far for the time given to strike, and that this condition will always lead more to direct conflict the more warlike our opponent is. Therefore, far from making it our aim to gain upon the enemy by complicated plans, we must rather seek to be beforehand with him by greater simplicity in our designs. If we seek for the lowest foundation stones of these converse propositions, we find that in the one it is ability, in the other courage. Now there is something very attractive in the notion that a moderate degree of courage, joined to great ability, will produce greater effects than a moderate ability with great courage. But unless we suppose these elements in a disproportionate relation, not logical, we have no right to assign to ability this advantage over courage in a field which is called danger, and which must be regarded as the true domain of courage. After this abstract view, we shall add only that experience, very far from leading to a different conclusion, is rather the sole cause which has impelled us in this direction, and given rise to such reflections. Whoever reads history with a mind free from prejudice cannot fail to arrive at a conclusion that of all military virtues, energy in the conduct of operations has always contributed the most to the glory and success of arms. How we make good our principle of regarding the destruction of the enemy's force as the principal object, not only in the war as a whole, but also in each separate combat, and how that principle suits all the forms and conditions necessarily demanded by the relations out of which war springs, the sequel will show. For the present all we desire is to uphold its general importance, and with this result we return again to the combat. Chapter 4. The Combat in General, Continuation. In the last chapter we showed the destruction of the enemy as the true object of the combat, and we have sought to prove by a special consideration of the point that this is true in the majority of cases, and in respect to the most important battles, because the destruction of the enemy's army is always the preponderating object in war. The other objects which may be mixed up with this destruction of the enemy's force, and may have more or less influence, we shall describe generally in the next chapter, and become better acquainted with by degrees afterwards. Here we divest the combat of them entirely, and look upon the destruction of the enemy as the complete and sufficient object of any combat. What are we now to understand by the destruction of the enemy's army? A diminution of it relatively greater than that of our own side. If we have a great superiority in numbers over the enemy, then naturally the same absolute amount of loss on both sides is for us a smaller one than for him, and consequently may be regarded in itself as an advantage. As we are here considering the combat as divested from all other objects, we must also exclude from our consideration the case in which the combat is used only indirectly for a greater destruction of the enemy's force. Consequently also, only that direct gain which has been made in the mutual process of destruction is to be regarded as the object, for this is an absolute gain which runs through the whole campaign, and at the end of it will always appear as pure profit. But every other kind of victory over our opponent will either have its motive in other objects, which we have completely excluded here, or it will only yield a temporary relative advantage. An example will make this plain. If by a skilful disposition we have reduced our opponent to such a dilemma that he cannot continue the combat without danger, and after some resistance he retires, then we may say that we have conquered him at that point. But if in this victory we have expended just as many forces as the enemy, then in closing the account of the campaign there is no gain remaining from this victory, if such a result can be called a victory. Therefore the overcoming the enemy, that is, placing him in such a position that he must give up the fight, counts for nothing in itself, and for that reason cannot come under the definition of object. There remains therefore, as we have said, nothing over except the direct gain which we have made in the process of destruction. But to this belong not only the losses which have taken place in the course of the combat, but also those which, after the withdrawal of the conquered part, take place as direct consequences of the same. Now it is known by experience that the losses in physical forces in the course of a battle seldom present a great difference between victor and vanquished respectively, often none at all, sometimes even one bearing an inverse relation to the result, and that the most decisive losses on the side of the vanquished only commence with the retreat, that is, those which the conqueror does not share with him. The weak remains of battalions already in disorder are cut down by cavalry. Exhausted men strew the ground, disabled guns and broken caissons are abandoned. Others, in the bad state of the roads, cannot be removed quickly enough, and are captured by the enemy's troops. During the night numbers lose their way and fall defenceless into the enemy's hands, and thus the victory mostly gains bodily substance after it is already decided. Here would be a paradox if it did not solve itself in the following manner. The loss in physical force is not the only one which the two sides suffer in the course of the combat. The moral forces are also shaken, broken, and go to ruin. It is not only the loss in men, horses, and guns, but in order, courage, confidence, cohesion, and plan, which come into consideration when it is a question whether the fight can still be continued or not. It is principally the moral forces which decide here, and in all cases in which the conqueror has lost as heavily as the conquered, it is these alone. The comparative relation of the physical losses is difficult to estimate in a battle, but not so the relation of the moral ones. Two things principally make it known. The first is the loss of the ground on which the fight has taken place, the other the superiority of the enemies. The more our reserves have diminished as compared with those of the enemy, the more force we have used to maintain the equilibrium. In this at once an evident proof of the moral superiority of the enemy is given which seldom fails to stir up in the soul of the Commander a certain bitterness of feeling, and a sort of contempt for his own troops. But the principal thing is, that men who have been engaged for a long continuance of time are more or less like burnt out cinders. Their ammunition is consumed, they have melted away to a certain extent, physical and moral energies are exhausted, perhaps their courage is broken as well. Such a force, irrespective of the diminution in its number, if viewed as an organic whole, is very different from what it was before the combat, and thus it is that the loss of moral force may be measured by the reserves which have been used as if it were on a foot rule. Lost ground and want of fresh reserves are, therefore, usually the principal causes which determine a retreat, but at the same time we by no means exclude or desire to throw into the shade other reasons which may lie in the interdependence of the parts of the Army, in the general plan, and such. Every combat is therefore the bloody and destructive measuring of the strength of forces, physical and moral. Whoever at the close has the greatest amount of both left is the conqueror. In the combat the loss of moral force is the chief cause of the decision. After that is given, this loss continues to increase until it reaches its culminating point at the close of the whole act. This then is the opportunity the victor should seize to reap his harvest by the utmost possible restrictions of his enemy's forces, the real object of engaging in the combat. On the beaten side, the loss of all order and control often makes the prolongation of resistance by individual units, by the further punishment they are certain to suffer, more injurious than useful to the whole. The spirit of the mass is broken, the original excitement about losing or winning, through which danger was forgotten, is spent, and to the majority danger now appears no longer an appeal to their courage, but rather the endurance of a cruel punishment. Thus the instrument in the first moment of the enemy's victory is weakened and blunted, and therefore no longer fit to repay danger by danger. This period, however, passes. The moral forces of the conquered will recover by degrees, order will be restored, courage will revive, and in the majority of cases there remains only a small part of the superiority obtained, often none at all. In some cases even, although rarely, the spirit of revenge and intensified hostility may bring about an opposite result. On the other hand, whatever is gained in killed, wounded, prisoners, and guns captured, can never disappear from the account. The losses in a battle consist more in killed and wounded, those after the battle more in artillery taken and prisoners. The first the conqueror shares with the conquered, more or less, but the second not, and for that reason they usually only take place on one side of the conflict, at least they are considerably in excess on one side. Artillery and prisoners are therefore at all times regarded as the true trophies of victory, as well as its measure, because through these things its extent is declared beyond a doubt. Even the degree of moral superiority may be better judged by them than by any other relation, especially if the number of killed and wounded is compared therewith, and here arises a new power increasing the moral effects. We have said that the moral forces, beaten to the ground in the battle and in the immediately succeeding movements, recover themselves gradually and often bear no traces of injury. This is the case with small divisions of the whole, less frequently with large divisions. It may, however, also be the case with the main army, but seldom or never in the state or government to which the army belongs. These estimate the situation more impartially, and from a more elevated point of view, and recognise in the number of trophies taken by the enemy, and their relation to the number of killed and wounded, only too easily and well the measure of their own weakness and inefficiency. In point of fact, the lost balance of moral power must not be treated lightly, because it has no absolute value, and because it does not of necessity appear in all cases in the amounts of the results at the final close. It may become of such excessive weight as to bring down everything with an irresistible force. On that account it may often become a great aim of the operation of which we shall speak elsewhere. Here we have still to examine some of its fundamental relations. The moral effect of a victory increases not merely in proportion to the extent of the forces engaged, but in a progressive ratio, that is to say, not only in extent, but also in its intensity. In a beaten detachment, order is easily restored. As a single frozen limb is easily revived by the rest of the body, so the courage of a defeated detachment is easily raised again by the courage of the rest of the Army as soon as it rejoins it. If, therefore, the effects of a small victory are not completely done away with, still they are partly lost to the enemy. This is not the case if the Army itself sustains a great defeat, then one with the other fall together. A great fire attains quite a different heat from several small ones. Another relation which determines the moral value of a victory is the numerical relation of the forces which have been in conflict with each other. To beat many with few is not only a double success, but shows also a greater, especially a more general, superiority, which the conquered must always be fearful of encountering again. At the same time, this influence is in reality hardly observable in such a case. In the moment of real action, the notions of the actual strength of the enemy are generally so uncertain, the estimate of our own commonly so incorrect, that the party superior in numbers either does not admit the disproportion, or is very far from admitting the full truth, owing to which he evades almost entirely the moral disadvantages which would spring from it. It is only hereafter in history that the truth, long suppressed through ignorance, vanity, or a wise discretion, makes its appearance, and then it certainly casts a lustre on the Army and its leader, but it can then do nothing more by its moral influence for events long past. If prisoners and captured guns are those things by which the victory principally gains substance, its true crystallisations, then the plan of the battle should have those things specially in view. The destruction of the enemy by death and wounds appears here merely as a means to an end. How far this may influence the dispositions in battle is not an affair of strategy, but the decision to fight the battle is in intimate connection with it, as is shown by the direction given to our forces and their general grouping, whether we threaten the enemy's flank or rear, or he threatens ours. On this point the number of prisoners and captured guns depends very much, and it is a point which, in many cases, tactics alone cannot satisfy, particularly if the strategic relations are too much in opposition to it. The risk of having to fight on two sides, and the still more dangerous position of having no line of retreat left open, paralyse the movements and the power of resistance. Further, in case of defeat, they increase the loss, often raising it to its extreme point, that is, to destruction. Therefore, the rear being endangered makes defeat more probable, and at the same time more decisive. From this arises, in the whole conduct of the War, especially in great and small combats, a perfect instinct to secure our own line of retreat and to seize that of the enemy. This follows from the conception of victory, which, as we have seen, is something beyond mere slaughter. In this effort we see, therefore, the first immediate purpose in the combat, and one which is quite universal. No combat is imaginable in which this effort, either in its double or single form, does not go hand in hand with the plain and simple stroke of force. Even the smallest troop will not throw itself upon its enemy without thinking of its line of retreat, and, in most cases, it will have an eye upon that of the enemy also. We should have to digress to show how often this instinct is prevented from going the direct road, how often it must yield to the difficulties arising from more important considerations. We shall, therefore, rest contented with affirming it to be a general natural law of the combat. It is, therefore, active, presses everywhere with its natural weight, and so becomes the pivot on which almost all tactical and strategic manoeuvres turn. If we now take a look at the conception of victory as a whole, we find in it three elements. 1. The greater loss of the enemy in physical power. 2. In moral power. 3. His open avowal of this by the relinquishment of his intentions. The returns made up on each side of losses in killed and wounded are never exact, seldom truthful, and in most cases full of intentional misrepresentations. Even the statement of the number of trophies is seldom to be quite depended on. Consequently, when it is not considerable, it may also cast a doubt even on the reality of the victory. Of the loss in moral forces there is no reliable measure except in the trophies. Therefore, in many cases, the giving up the contest is the only real evidence of the victory. It is, therefore, to be regarded as a confession of inferiority, as the lowering of the flag, by which in this particular instance right and superiority are conceded to the enemy, and this degree of humiliation and disgrace, which, however, must be distinguished from all other moral consequences of the loss of equilibrium, is an essential part of the victory. It is this part alone which acts upon the public opinion outside the Army, upon the people and the Government in both belligerent states, and upon all others in any way concerned. But renouncement of the general object is not quite identical with quitting the field of battle, even when the battle has been very obstinate and long kept up. No one says of advanced posts, when they retire after an obstinate combat, that they have given up their object. Even in combats aimed at the destruction of the enemy's army, the retreat from the battlefield is not always to be regarded as a relinquishment of this aim, as for instance in retreats planned beforehand, in which the ground is disputed foot by foot. All this belongs to that part of our subject where we shall speak of the separate object of the combat. Here we only wish to draw attention to the fact that in most cases the giving up of the object is very difficult to distinguish from the retirement from the battlefield, and that the impression produced by the latter, both in and out of the Army, is not to be treated lightly. For generals and armies whose reputation is not made, this is in itself one of the difficulties in many operations, justified by circumstances when a succession of combats, each ending in retreat, may appear as a succession of defeats, without being so in reality, and when that appearance may exercise a very depressing influence. It is impossible for the retreating General, by making known his real intentions, to prevent the moral effect spreading to the public and his troops, for to do that with effect he must disclose his plans completely, which, of course, would run counter to his principal interests to too great a degree. In order to draw attention to the special importance of this conception of victory, we shall only refer to the Battle of Soor, the trophies from which were not important, a few thousand prisoners and 20 guns, and where Frederick proclaimed his victory by remaining for 5 days after on the field of battle, although his retreat into Silesia had been previously determined on, and was a measure natural to his whole situation. According to his own account, he thought he would hasten a peace by the moral effect of his victory. Now, although a couple of other successes were likewise required, namely the battle of Katholisch-Herensdorf in Lusitania, and the battle of Kesseldorf, before this peace took place, still we cannot say that the moral effect of the Battle of Soor was nil. If it is chiefly the moral force which is shaken by defeat, and if the number of trophies reaped up by the enemy mounts up to an unusual height, then the lost combat becomes a rout. But this is not the necessary consequence of every victory. A rout only sets in when the moral force of the defeated is very severely shaken. Then there often ensues a complete incapability of further resistance, and the whole action consists of giving way, that is, of flight. Jena and Belle Alliance were routs, but not so Borodino. Although without pedantry we can give here no single line of separation, because the difference between the things is one of degrees, yet still the retention of the conception is essential as a central point to give clearness to our theoretical ideas, and it is a want in our terminology that for a victory over the enemy tantamount to a rout, and a conquest of the enemy only tantamount to a simple victory, there is only one and the same word to use. Chapter 5. On the signification of the combat. Having in the preceding chapter examined the combat in its absolute form, as the miniature picture of the whole war, we now turn to the relations which it bears to the other parts of the great whole. First we inquire what is more precisely the signification of a combat. As War is nothing else but a mutual process of destruction, then the most natural answer in conception, and perhaps also in reality, appears to be that all the powers of each party unite in one great volume, and all results in one great shock of these masses. There is certainly much truth in this idea, and it seems to be very advisable that we should adhere to it, and should on that account look upon small combats at first only as necessary loss, like the shavings from a carpenter's plane. Still, however, the thing cannot be settled so easily. That a multiplication of combats should arise from a fractioning of forces is a matter of course, and the more immediate objects of separate combats will therefore come before us in the subject of a fractioning of forces. But these objects, and together with them the whole mass of combats, may in a general way be brought under certain classes, and the knowledge of these classes will contribute to make our observations more intelligible. Destruction of the enemy's military forces is in reality the object of all combats, but other objects may be joined thereto, and these other objects may be at the same time predominant. We must therefore draw a distinction between those in which the destruction of the enemy's forces is the principal object, and those in which it is more the means. The destruction of the enemy's force, the possession of a place or the possession of some object, may be the general motive for a combat, and it may be either one of these alone or several together, in which case, however, usually one is the principal motive. Now, the two principal forms of War, the offensive and defensive, of which we shall shortly speak, do not modify the first of these motives, but they certainly do modify the other two, and therefore if we arrange them in a scheme they would appear thus: offensive, 1. Destruction of the enemy's force. 2. Conquest of a place. 3. Conquest of some object. Defensive, 1. Destruction of enemy's force. 2. Defence of a place. 3. Defence of some object. These motives, however, do not seem to embrace completely the whole of the subject, if we recollect that there are reconnaissances and demonstrations in which plainly none of these 3 points is the object of the combat. In reality we must, therefore, on this account be allowed a 4th class. Strictly speaking, in reconnaissances in which we wish the enemy to show himself, in alarms by which we wish to wear him out, in demonstrations by which we wish to prevent his leaving some point, or to draw him off to another, the objects are all such as can only be attained indirectly, and under the pretext of one of the 3 objects specified in the table, usually of the second. For the enemy, whose aim it is to reconnoitre, must draw up his force as if he really intended to attack and defeat us, or drive us off, and such, but this pretended object is not the real one, and our present question is only as to the latter. Therefore we must, to the above 3 objects of the offensive, add a 4th, which is to lead the enemy to make a false conclusion. That offensive means are conceivable in connection with this object lies in the nature of the thing. On the other hand, we must observe that the defence of a place may be of 2 kinds, either absolute, if as a general question the point is not to be given up, or relative, if it is only required for a certain time. The latter happens perpetually in the combats of advanced posts and rear guards. That the nature of these different intentions of the combat must have an essential influence on the dispositions which are its preliminaries is a thing clear in itself. We act differently if our object is merely to drive an enemy's post out of its place, from what we should if our object was to beat him completely; differently if we mean to defend a place to the last extremity, from what we should do if our design is only to detain the enemy for a certain time. In the first case we trouble ourselves little about the line of retreat, in the latter it is the principal point, and such. But these reflections belong properly to tactics, and are only introduced here by way of example for the sake of greater clearness. What strategy has to say on the different objects of the combat will appear in the chapters which touch upon these objects. Here we have only a few general observations to make. First, that the importance of the object decreases nearly in the order as they stand above. Therefore, that the first of these objects must always predominate in the great battle. Lastly, that the two last in a defensive battle are in reality such as yield no fruit. They are, that is to say, purely negative, and can, therefore, only be serviceable indirectly by facilitating something else which is positive. It is, therefore, a bad sign of the strategic situation if battles of this kind become too frequent. Chapter 6. Duration of the combat. If we consider the combat no longer in itself, but in relation to the other forces of war, then its duration acquires a special importance. The duration is to be regarded, to a certain extent, as a second subordinate success. For the conqueror, the combat can never be finished too quickly; for the vanquished, it can never last too long. A speedy victory indicates a higher power of victory. A tardy decision is, on the side of the defeated, some compensation for the loss. This is in general true, but it acquires a practical importance in its application to those combats the object of which is a relative defence. Here the whole success often lies in the mere duration. This is the reason why we have included it amongst the strategic elements. The duration of combat is necessarily bound up with its essential relations. These relations are absolute magnitude of force, relation of force and of the different arms mutually, and nature of the country. 20,000 men do not wear themselves out upon one another as quickly as 2,000. We cannot resist an enemy double or 3 times our strength as long as one of the same strength. A cavalry combat is decided sooner than an infantry combat, and a combat between infantry only quicker than if there is artillery as well. In hills and forests we cannot advance as quickly as on a level country. All this is clear enough. From this it follows, therefore, that strength, relation of the 3 arms, and position must be considered if the combat is to fulfil an object by its duration. But to set up this rule was of less importance to us in our present considerations than to connect with it at once the chief results which experience gives us on the subject. Even the resistance of an ordinary division of 8,000 to 10,000 men of all arms, opposed to an enemy considerably superior in numbers, will last several hours, if the advantages of country are not too preponderating, and if the enemy is only a little, or not at all, superior in numbers. The combat will last half a day. A corps of 3 or 4 divisions will prolong it to double the time, an army of 80,000 or 100,000 to 3 or 4 times. Therefore the masses may be left to themselves for that length of time, and no separate combat takes place if within that time other forces can be brought up, whose cooperation mingles them at once into one stream with the results of the combat which has taken place. These calculations are the result of experience, but it is important for us at the same time to characterise more particularly the moment of the decision, and consequently the termination. End of Book 4, Chapter 6. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. Of On War. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. On War by Carl von Clausewitz. Translated by Colonel J. J. Graham. Book 4, Chapter 7. Decision of the combat. No battle is decided in a single moment, although in every battle there arise moments of crisis, on which the result depends. The loss of a battle is, therefore, a gradual falling off the scale, but there is in every combat a point of time when it may be regarded as decided, in such a way that the renewal of the fight would be a new battle, not a continuation of the old one. To have a clear notion on this point of time is very important in order to be able to decide whether, with the prompt assistance of reinforcements, the combat can again be resumed with advantage. Often in combats which are beyond restoration, new forces are sacrificed in vain, Often through neglect, the decision has not been seized when it might easily have been secured. Here are two examples which could not be more to the point. When the Prince of Hohenlohe, in 1806, at Jena, with 35,000 men, opposed to from 60,000 to 70,000 under Bonaparte, had accepted battle and lost it, but lost it in such a way that the 35,000 may be regarded as dissolved, General Ruchel undertook to renew the fight with about 12,000. The consequence was that in a moment his force was scattered in like manner. On the other hand, on the same day at Auerstadt, the Prussians maintained a combat with 25,000 against Davoust, who had 28,000, until midday, without success it is true, but still without the force being reduced to a state of dissolution, without even greater loss than the enemy, who was very deficient in cavalry. But they neglected to use the reserve of 18,000 under General Kalkreuth to restore the battle which, under these circumstances, it would have been impossible to lose. Each combat is a whole in which the partial combats combine themselves into one total result. In this total result lies the decision of the combat. This success need not be exactly a victory such as we have denoted in the 6th chapter, for often the preparations for that have not been made. Often there is no opportunity if the enemy gives way too soon, and in most cases the decision, even when the resistance has been obstinate, takes place before such a degree of success is attained as would completely satisfy the idea of victory. We therefore ask, which is commonly the moment of the decision, that is to say, the moment when a fresh, effective, of course not disproportionate, force can no longer turn a disadvantageous battle. If we pass over false attacks, which in accordance with their nature are properly without decision, then 1. If the possession of a movable object was the object of the combat, the loss of the same is always the decision. 2. If the possession of ground was the object of the combat, then the decision generally lies in its loss. Still not always. Only if this ground is of peculiar strength, ground which is easy to pass over, however important it may be in other respects, cannot be retaken without much danger. 3. But in all cases where these two circumstances have not already decided the combat, therefore, particularly in case the destruction of the enemy's force is the principal object, the decision is reached at the moment when the conqueror ceases to feel himself in a state of disintegration, that is, of unserviceableness to a certain extent. When, therefore, there is no advantage in using the successive efforts spoken of in the 12th chapter of the 3rd book. On this ground we have given the strategic unity of the battle its place here. A battle, therefore, in which the assailant has not lost his condition of order and perfect efficiency at all, or at least only in a small part of his force, whilst the opposing forces are more or less disorganised throughout, is only not to be retrieved, and just as little if the enemy has recovered his inefficiency. The smaller, therefore, that part of a force is which has really been engaged, the greater that portion which as a reserve has contributed to the result only by its presence. So much the less will any new force of the enemy wrest again the victory from our hands, and that commander who carries out to the furthest with his army the principle of conducting the combat with the greatest economy of forces, and making the most of the moral effect of strong reserves, goes the surest way to victory. We must allow that the French, in modern times, especially when led by Bonaparte, have shown a thorough mastery in this. Further, the moment when the crisis stage of the combat ceases with the conqueror, and his original state of order is restored, takes place sooner the smaller the unit he controls. A picket of cavalry pursuing an enemy at full gallop will, in a few moments, resume its proper order, and the crisis ceases. A whole regiment of cavalry requires a longer time. It lasts still longer with infantry. If extended in single lines of skirmishers, and longer again with divisions of all three arms, when it happens by chance that one part has taken one direction and another part another direction, and the combat has therefore caused a loss of the order of formulation, which usually becomes still worse from not knowing exactly where the other is. Thus, therefore, the point of time when the conqueror has collected the instruments he has been using, and which are mixed up and partly out of order, the moment when he has in some measure rearranged them and put them in their proper places, and thus brought the battle workshop into a little order. This moment, we say, is always later, the greater the total force. Again, this moment comes later if night overtakes the conqueror in the crisis, and lastly it comes later still if the country is broken and thickly wooded. But with regard to these 2 points, we must observe that night is also a great means of protection, and it is only seldom that circumstances favour the expectation of a successful result from a night attack, as on March 10th, 1814, at Laon, where York against Marmont gives us an example completely in place here. In the same way, a wooded and broken country will afford protection against the reaction of those who are engaged in the long crisis of victory. Both, therefore, the night as well as the wooded and broken country, are obstacles which make the renewal of the same battle more difficult instead of facilitating it. Hitherto we have considered assistance arriving for the losing side as a mere increase of force, therefore as a reinforcement coming up directly from the rear, which is the most usual case, but the case is quite different if these fresh forces come upon the enemy in flank or rear. On the effect of flank or rear tactics so far as they belong to strategy, we shall speak in another place. Such a one as we have here in view, intended for the restoration of the combat, belongs chiefly to tactics, and is only mentioned because we are here speaking of tactical results. Our ideas therefore must stretch upon the province of tactics. By directing a force against the enemy's flank and rear, its efficiency may be much intensified, but this is so far from being a necessary result always, that the efficiency may, on the other hand, be just as much weakened. The circumstances under which the combat has taken place decide upon this part of the plan, as well as upon every other, without our being able to enter upon here. But at the same time there are 2 things of importance for our subject. First, flank and rear attacks have, as a rule, a more favourable effect on the consequences of the decision than upon the decision itself. Now, as concerns the retrieving a battle, the first thing to be arrived at above all is a favourable decision, and not magnitude of success. In this view one would therefore think that a force which comes to re-establish our combat is of less assistance if it falls upon the enemy in flank and rear, therefore separated from us, than if it joins itself to us directly. Certainly cases are not wanting where it is so, but we must say that the majority are on the other side, and they are so on account of the second point which is here important to us. This second point is the moral effect of the surprise, which, as a rule, a reinforcement coming up to re-establish combat has generally in its favour. Now, the effect of a surprise is always heightened if it takes place in the flank or rear, and an enemy completely engaged in the crisis of victory in his extended and scattered order is less in a state to counteract it. Who does not feel that an attack in flank or rear, which at the commencement of the battle, when forces are concentrated and prepared for such an event, would be of little importance, gains quite another weight in the last moment of the combat? We must therefore at once admit that in most cases a reinforcement coming up on the flank or rear of the enemy will be more efficacious, will be like the same weight at the end of a longer lever, and therefore that under these circumstances we may undertake to restore the battle with the same force which, employed in a direct attack, would be quite insufficient. Here results almost defy calculation, because the moral forces gain completely the ascendancy. This is therefore the right field for boldness and daring. The eye must therefore be directed on all these objects. All these moments of co-operating forces must be taken into consideration when we have to decide in doubtful cases whether or not it is still possible to restore a combat which has taken an unfavourable turn. If the combat is to be regarded as not yet ended, then the new contest which is opened by the arrival of assistance fuses into the former. Therefore they flow together into one common result, and the first disadvantage vanishes completely out of the calculation. But this is not the case if the combat was already decided. Then there are 2 results separate from each other. Now, if the assistance which arrives is only of a relative strength, That is, if it is not in itself alone a match for the enemy, then a favourable result is hardly to be expected from this second combat. But if it is so strong that it can undertake the second combat without regard to the first, then it may be able, by a favourable issue, to compensate or even overbalance the first combat, but never to make it disappear altogether from the account. At the Battle of Kunersdorf, Frederick the Great at the first onset carried the left of the Russian position, and took 70 pieces of artillery. At the end of the battle both were lost again, and the whole result of the first combat was wiped out of the account. Had it been possible to stop at the first success, and to put off the second part of the battle to the coming day, then, even if the King had lost it, the advantages of the first would always have been a set-off to the second. But when a battle proceeding disadvantageously is arrested and turned before its conclusion, its minus result on our side not only disappears from the account, but also becomes the foundation of a greater victory. If, for instance, we picture to ourselves exactly the tactical course of the battle, we may easily see that until it is finally concluded, all successes in partial combats are only decisions in suspense, which by the capital decision may not only be destroyed, but changed into the opposite. The more our forces have suffered, the more the enemy will have expended on his side. The greater, therefore, will be the crisis for the enemy, and the more the superiority of our fresh troops will tell. If now the total result turns in our favour, if we wrest from the enemy the field of battle, and recover all the trophies again, then all the forces which he has sacrificed in obtaining them become sheer gain for us, and our former defeat becomes a stepping stone to a greater triumph. The most brilliant feats, which with victory the enemy would have so highly prized that the loss of forces which they cost would have been disregarded, leave nothing now behind but regret at the sacrifice entailed. Such is the alteration which the magic of victory and the curse of defeat produces in the specific weight of the same elements. Therefore, even if we are decidedly superior in strength, and are able to repay the enemy his victory by a greater still, it is always better to forestall the conclusion of a disadvantageous combat, if it is of proportionate importance, so as to turn its course rather than to deliver a second battle. Field Marshal Daun attempted in the year 1760 to come to the assistance of General Leyden at Liegnitz, whilst the battle lasted, but when he failed, he did not attack the King the next day, although he did not want for the means to do so. For these reasons, serious combats of advanced guards which precede a battle are to be looked upon only as necessary evils, and when not necessary they are to be avoided. We have still another conclusion to examine. If on a regular pitched battle the decision has gone against one, this does not constitute a motive for determining on a new one. The determination for this new one must proceed from other relations. This conclusion, however, is opposed by a moral force, which we must take into account. It is the feeling of rage and revenge. From the oldest field marshal to the youngest drummer boy, this feeling is general, and therefore troops are never in better spirits for fighting than when they have to wipe out a stain. This is, however, only on the supposition that the beaten portion is not too great in proportion to the whole, because otherwise the above feeling is lost in that of powerlessness. There is therefore a very natural tendency to use this moral force to repair the disaster on the spot, and on that account chiefly to seek another battle if other circumstances permit. It then lies in the nature of the case that this second battle must be an offensive one. In the catalogue of battles of second-rate importance there are many examples to be found of such retaliatory battles, but great battles have generally too many other determining causes to be brought on by this weaker motive. Such a feeling must undoubtedly have led the noble Blücher with his third corps to the field of battle on February 14th, 1814, when the other two had been beaten 3 days before at Montmiral. Had he known that he would have come upon Bonaparte in person, then naturally preponderating reasons would have determined him to put off his revenge to another day, but he hoped to revenge himself on Marmont, and instead of gaining the reward of his desire for honourable satisfaction, he suffered the penalty for his erroneous calculation. On the duration of the combat and the movement of its decision depend the distances from each other at which those masses should be placed which are intended to fight in conjunction with each other. This disposition would be a tactical arrangement in so far as it relates to one and the same battle. It can, however, be regarded as such, provided the position of the troops is so compact that the two separate combats cannot be imagined, and consequently that the space which the whole occupies can be regarded strategically as a mere point. But in War cases frequently occur where even those forces intended to fight in unison must be so far separated from each other that while their union for one common combat certainly remains the principal object, still the occurrence of separate combats remains possible. Such a disposition is therefore strategic. Dispositions of this kind are marches in separate masses and columns, the formation of advanced guards and flanking columns, also the grouping of reserves intended to serve as supports for more than one strategic point, the concentration of several corps from widely extended cantonments, and such and such. We can see that the necessity for these arrangements may constantly arise, and may consider them something like the small change in the strategic economy, whilst the capital battles, and all that rank with them, are the gold and silver pieces. Chapter 8. Mutual Understanding as to a Battle. No battle can take place unless by mutual consent, and in this idea, which constitutes the whole basis of a duel, is the root of a certain phraseology used by historical writers, which leads to many indefinite and false conceptions. According to the view of the writers to whom we refer, it has frequently happened that one commander has offered battle to the other, and the latter has not accepted it. But the battle is a very modified duel, and its foundation is not merely in the mutual wish to fight, that is, in consent, but in the objects which are bound up with the battle. These belong always to a greater whole, and that so much more, as even the whole War, considered as a combat unit, has political objectives and conditions which belong to a higher standpoint. The mere desire to conquer each other therefore falls into quite a subordinate relation, or rather it ceases completely to be anything of itself, and only becomes the nerve which conveys the impulse of action from the higher will. Amongst the ancients, and then again during the early period of standing armies, the expression that we had offered battle to the enemy in vain had more sense in it than it has now. By the ancients everything was constituted with a view to measuring each other's strength in the open field, free from anything in the nature of a hindrance, and the whole art of war consisted in the organisation and formation of the army, that is, in the order of battle. Now, as the armies regularly entrenched themselves in their camps, therefore the position in a camp was regarded as something unassailable, and a battle did not become possible until the enemy left his camp, and placed himself in a practicable country, as it were, entered the lists. If therefore we hear about Hannibal having offered battle to Fabius in vain, that tells us nothing more as regards the latter than that a battle was not part of his plan, and in itself neither proves the physical nor moral superiority of Hannibal, but with respect to him the expression is still correct enough in the sense that Hannibal really wished a battle. In the early period of modern armies the relations were similar in great combats and battles, that is to say, great masses were brought into action, and managed throughout it by means of an order of battle, which like a great helpless whole required a more or less level plain, and was neither suited to attack nor yet to defence in a broken, close, or even mountainous country. The defender, therefore, had here also to some extent the means of avoiding battle. These relations, although gradually becoming modified, continued until the first Silesian War, and it was not until the 7 Years' War that attacks on an enemy posted in a difficult country gradually became feasible and of ordinary occurrence. Ground did not certainly cease to be a principle of strength to those making use of its aid, but it was no longer a charmed circle which shut out the natural forces of war. During the past 30 years, war has perfected itself much more in this respect, and there is no longer anything which stands in the way of a general who is in earnest about a decision by means of battle. He can seek out his enemy and attack him. If he does not do so, he cannot take credit for having wished to fight, and the expression he offered a battle which his opponent did not accept, therefore now means nothing more than that he did not find circumstances advantageous enough for a battle, an admission which the above expression does not suit, but which it only strives to throw a veil over. It is true the defensive side can no longer refuse a battle, yet he may still avoid it by giving up his position, and the role with which that position was connected. This is, however, half a victory for the offensive side, and an acknowledgment of his superiority for the present. This idea, in connection with the cartel of defiance, can therefore no longer be made use of, in order of such rhodomontade, to qualify the inaction of him whose part it is to advance, that is, the offensive. The defender, who as long as he does not give way, must have the credit of willing the battle, may certainly say he has offered it if he is not attacked, if that is not understood of itself. But on the other hand, he who now wishes to, and can retreat, cannot easily be forced to give battle. Now as the advantages to the aggressor from this retreat are often not sufficient, and a substantial victory is a matter of urgent necessity for him, in that way the few means which there are to compel such an opponent also to give battle are often sought for, and applied with particular skill. The principal means for this are, first, surrounding the enemy so as to make his retreat impossible, or at least so difficult that it is better for him to accept battle, and secondly, surprising him. This last way, for which there was a motive formerly in the extreme difficulty of all movements, has become in modern times very inefficacious. From the pliability and manoeuvring capabilities of troops in the present day, one does not hesitate to commence a retreat, even in sight of the enemy, and only some special obstacles in the nature of the country can cause serious difficulties in the operation. As an example of this kind, the Battle of Neresheim may be given, fought by the Archduke Charles with Moreau in the Rhone Alp, August 11th, 1796, merely with a view to facilitate his retreat, although we freely confess we have never been able quite to understand the argument of the renowned General and author himself in this case. The Battle of Rossbach is another example, if we suppose the commander of the Allied army had not really the intention of attacking Frederick the Great. Of the Battle of Soor, the King himself says that it was only fought because a retreat in the presence of the enemy appeared to him a critical operation. At the same time, the King has also given other reasons for the battle. On the whole, regular night surprises excepted, such cases will always be of rare occurrence, and those in which an enemy is compelled to fight by being practically surrounded will happen mostly to a single corps only, like Mortimer's at Durenstein, 1809, and Van Dam at Kulm, 1813. Chapter 9. The Battle. Its Decision. What is a battle? A conflict of the main body, but not an unimportant one about a secondary object, not a mere attempt which is given up when we see betimes that our object is hardly within our reach. It is a conflict waged with all our forces for the attainment of a decisive victory. Minor objects may also be mixed up with the principal object, and it will take many different tones of colour from the circumstances out of which it originates, for a battle belongs also to a greater whole, of which it is only a part, but because the essence of war is conflict, and the battle is the conflict of the main armies, it is always to be regarded as the real centre of gravity of the war, and therefore its distinguishing character is, that, unlike all other encounters, it is arranged for, and undertaken with the sole purpose of obtaining a decisive victory. This has an influence on the manner of its decision, on the effect of the victory contained in it, and determines the value which theory is to assign to it as a means to an end. On that account we make it the subject of our special consideration, and at this stage, before we enter upon the special ends which may be bound up with it, but which do not essentially alter its character, if it really deserves to be termed a battle. If a battle takes place principally on its own account, the elements of its decision must be contained in itself. In other words, victory must be striven for as long as a possibility or hope remains. It must not, therefore, be given up on account of secondary circumstances, but only and alone in the event of the forces appearing completely insufficient. Now, how is that precise moment to be described? If a certain artificial formation and cohesion of an Army is the principal condition under which the bravery of the troops can gain a victory, as was the case during a great part of the period of the modern art of war, then the breaking up of this formation is the decision. A beaten wing which is put out of joint decides the fate of all that was connected with it. If, as was the case at another time, the essence of the defence consists in an intimate alliance of the Army with the ground on which it fights, and its obstacles, so the Army and position are only one, then the conquest of an essential point in this position is the decision. It is said that the key of the position is lost, it cannot therefore be defended any further, the battle cannot be continued. In both cases, the beaten armies are very much like the broken strings of an instrument which cannot do their work. That geometrical, as well as this geographical principle, which had a tendency to place an army in a state of crystallizing tension, which did not allow of the available powers being made use of up to the last man, have at least so far lost their influence that they no longer predominate. Armies are still led into battle in a certain order, but that order is no longer of decisive importance. Obstacles of ground are also still turned to account to strengthen a position, but they are no longer the only support. We attempted in the second chapter of this book to take a general view of the nature of the modern battle. According to our conception of it, the order of battle is only a disposition of the forces suitable to the convenient use of them, and the course of the battle a mutual slow wearing away of these forces upon one another, to see which will have soonest exhausted his adversary. The resolution, therefore, to give up the fight arises, in a battle more than in any other combat, from the relation of the fresh reserves remaining available, for only these still retain all their moral vigour, and the cinders of the battered, knocked about battalions, already burnt out in the destroying element, must not be placed on a level with them. Also, lost ground, as we have elsewhere said, is a standard of lost moral force. It therefore comes also into account, but more as a sign of loss suffered than for the loss itself, and the number of fresh reserves is always the chief point to be looked at by both commanders. In general, an action inclines in one direction from the very commencement, but in a manner little observable. This direction is also frequently given in a very decided manner by the arrangements which have been made previously, and then it shows a want of discernment in that General who commences battle under these unfavourable circumstances without being aware of them. Even when this does not occur, it lies in the nature of things that the course of battle resembles rather a slow disturbance of equilibrium, which commences soon, but, as we have said, almost imperceptibly at first, and then with each moment of time becomes stronger and more visible than an oscillating to and fro, as those who are misled by mendacious descriptions usually suppose. But whether it happens that the balance is for a long time little disturbed, or that even after it has been lost on one side it rights itself again, and is then lost on the other side, it is certain at all events that in most instances the defeated General foresees his fate long before he retreats, and that cases in which some critical event acts with unexpected force upon the course of the whole have their existence mostly in the colouring with which everyone depicts his lost battle. We can only here appeal to the decision of unprejudiced men of experience who will, we are sure, assent to what we have said, and answer for us to such of our readers as do not know war from their own experience. To develop the necessity of this course from the nature of the thing would lead us too far into the province of tactics, to which this branch of the subject belongs. We are here only concerned with its results. If we say that the defeated General foresees the unfavourable result, usually some time before he makes up his mind to give up the battle, we admit that there are also instances to the contrary, because otherwise we should maintain a proposition contradictory to itself. If at the moment of each decisive tendency of battle it should be considered as lost, then also no further forces should be used to give it a turn, and consequently this decisive tendency could not precede the retreat by any length of time. Certainly there are instances of battles which, after having taken a decided turn to one side, have still ended in favour of the other, but they are rare, not usual. These exceptional cases, however, are reckoned upon by every General against whom fortune declares itself, and he must reckon upon them as long as there remains a possibility of a turn of fortune. He hopes by stronger efforts, by raising the remaining moral forces, by surpassing himself, or also by some fortunate chance, that the next moment will bring a change, and pursues this as far as his courage and his judgment can agree. We shall have something more to say on this subject, but before that we must show what are the signs of the scales turning. The result of the whole combat consists in the sum total of the results of all partial combats, but these results of separate combats are settled by different considerations. First, by the pure moral power in the mind of the leading officers. If a General of Division has seen his battalions forced to succumb, it will have an influence on his demeanour and his reports, and these again will have an influence on the measures of the Commander-in-Chief. Therefore even those unsuccessful partial combats, which to all appearance are retrieved, are not lost in their results, and the impressions from them sum themselves up in the mind of the Commander without much trouble, and even against his will. Secondly, by the quicker melting away of our troops, which can be easily estimated in the slow and relatively little tumultuary course of our battles. Third, by lost ground. All these things serve for the eye of the General as a compass to tell the course of the battle in which he is embarked. If whole batteries have been lost and none of the enemy's taken, if battalions have been overthrown by the enemy's cavalry, whilst those of the enemy everywhere present impenetrable masses, if the line of fire from his order of battle wavers involuntarily from one point to another, if fruitless efforts have been made to gain certain points, and the assaulting battalions each time been scattered by well-directed volleys of grape and case, if our artillery begins to reply feebly to that of the enemy, if the battalions under fire diminish unusually fast, because with the wounded crowds of unwounded men go to the rear, if single divisions have been cut off and made prisoners through the disruption of the plan of battle, if the line of retreat begins to be endangered, the Commander may tell very well in which direction he is going with his battle. The longer this direction continues, the more decided it becomes, so much the more difficult will be the turning, so much the nearer the moment when he must give up the battle. We shall now make some observations on this moment. We have already said more than once that the final decision is ruled mostly by the relative number of fresh reserves remaining at the last. That Commander who sees his adversary is decidedly superior to him in this respect, makes up his mind to retreat. It is the characteristic of modern battles that all mischances and losses which take place in the course of the same can be retrieved by fresh forces, because the arrangement of the modern order of battle, and the way in which troops are brought into action, allow of their use almost generally, and in each position. So long, therefore, as that Commander against whom the issue seems to declare itself still retains a superiority in reserve force, he will not give up the day. But from the moment that his reserves begin to become weaker than his enemies, the decision may be regarded as settled, and what he now does depends partly on special circumstances, partly on the degree of courage and perseverance which he personally possesses, and which may degenerate into foolish obstinacy. How a Commander can attain to the power of estimating correctly the still remaining reserves on both sides is an affair of skilful practical genius, which does not in any way belong to this place. We keep ourselves to the result as it forms itself in his mind. But this conclusion is still not the moment of decision properly, for a motive which only arises gradually does not answer to that, but is only a general motive towards resolution, and the resolution itself requires still some special immediate causes. Of these there are two chief ones which constantly recur, that is, the danger of retreat and the arrival of night. If the retreat, with every new step which the battle takes in its course, becomes constantly in greater danger, and if the reserves are so much diminished that they are no longer adequate to get breathing room, then there is nothing left but to submit to fate, and by a well-conducted retreat to save what, by a longer delay ending in flight and disaster, would be lost. But night, as a rule, puts an end to all battles, because a night combat holds out no hope of advantage except under particular circumstances, and as night is better suited for a retreat than the day, so therefore the commander who must look at the retreat as a thing inevitable, or as most probable, will prefer to make use of the night for his purpose. That there are besides the above two usual and chief causes, yet many others also, which are less or more individual and not to be overlooked, is a matter of course. For the more a battle tends toward a complete upset of the equilibrium, the more sensible is the influence of each partial result in hastening the turn. Thus the loss of a battery, a successful charge of a couple of regiments of cavalry, may call into life the resolution to retreat already ripening. As a conclusion to this subject, we must dwell for a moment on the point at which the courage of the commander engages in a sort of conflict with his reason. If, on the one hand, the overbearing pride of a victorious conqueror, if the inflexible will of a naturally obstinate spirit, if the strenuous resistance of noble feelings will not yield the battlefield where they must leave their honour, yet, on the other hand, reason counsels not to give up everything, not to risk the last upon the game, but to retain as much over as is necessary for an orderly retreat. However highly we must esteem courage and firmness in war, and however little prospect there is of victory to him who cannot resolve to seek it by the exertion of all his power, still there is a point beyond which perseverance can only be termed desperate folly, and therefore can meet with no approbation from any critic. In the most celebrated of all battles, that of Belle Alliance, Bonaparte used his last reserve in an effort to retrieve a battle which was past being retrieved. He spent his last farthing, and then, as a beggar, abandoned both the battlefield and his crown. Chapter 10. Effects of Victory. Continuation. According to the point from which our view is taken, we may feel as much astonished at the extraordinary results of some great battles as to the want of results in others. We shall dwell for a moment on the nature of the effect of a great victory. Three things may easily be distinguished here: the effect upon the instrument itself, that is, upon the generals and their armies; the effect upon the states interested in the war; and the particular result of these effects as manifested in the subsequent course of the campaign. If we only think of the trifling difference which there usually is between victor and vanquished in killed, wounded, prisoners, and artillery lost on the field of battle itself, the consequences which are developed out of this insignificant point seem often quite incomprehensible, and yet usually everything only happens quite naturally. We have already said in the 7th chapter that the magnitude of a victory increases not merely in the same measure as the vanquished forces increase in number, but in a higher ratio. The moral effects resulting from the issue of a great battle are greater on the side of the conquered than on that of the conqueror. They lead to greater losses in physical force, which then in turn react on the moral element, and so they go on mutually supporting and intensifying each other. On this moral effect we must therefore lay special weight. It takes an opposite direction on the one side from that on the other. As it undermines the energies of the conquered, so it elevates the powers and energy of the conqueror. But its chief effect is upon the vanquished, because here it is the direct cause of fresh losses, and because it is homogeneous in nature with danger, with the fatigues, the hardships, and generally with all those embarrassing circumstances by which war is surrounded, therefore enters into league with them, and increases by their help, whilst with the conqueror all these things are like weights which give a higher swing to his courage. It is therefore found that the vanquished sinks much further below the original line of equilibrium than the conqueror raises himself above it. On this account, if we speak of the effects of victory, we allude more particularly to those which manifest themselves in the Army. If this effect is more powerful in an important combat than in a smaller one, so again it is much more powerful in a great battle than in a minor one. The great battle takes place for the sake of itself, for the sake of the victory which it is to give, and which is sought for with the utmost effort. Here, on this spot, in this very hour, to conquer the enemy, is the purpose in which the plan of the war, with all its threads, converges, in which all distant hopes, all dim glimmerings of future meet. Fate steps in before us to give an answer to the bold question. This is the state of mental tension not only of the commander, but of his whole army, down to the lowest waggon driver, no doubt in decreasing strength, but also in decreasing importance. According to the nature of the thing, a great battle has never, at any time, been an unprepared, unexpected, blind, routine service, but a grand act, which, partly of itself, and partly from the aim of the commander, stands out from among the mass of ordinary efforts, sufficient to raise the tension of all minds to a higher degree. But the higher this tension with respect to the issue, the more powerful must be the effect of that issue. Again, the moral effect of victory in our battles is greater than it was in the earlier ones of modern military history. If the former are, as we have depicted them, a real struggle of forces to the utmost, then the sum total of all these forces, of the physical as well as the moral, must decide more than certain special dispositions or mere chance. A single fault committed may be repaired next time. From good fortune and chance we can hope for more favour on another occasion, but the sum total of moral and physical powers cannot be so quickly altered, and therefore what the award of a victory has decided appears of much greater importance for all futurity. Very probably of all concerned in battles, whether in or out of the army, very few have given a thought to this difference. But the course of a battle itself impresses on the minds of all present in it such a conviction, and the relation of this course in public documents, however much it may be coloured by twisting particular circumstances, shows also more or less to the world at large that the causes were more of a general than a particular nature. He who has not been present at the loss of a great battle will have difficulty in forming for himself a living or quite true idea of it, and the abstract notions of this or that small untoward affair will never come up to the perfect conception of a lost battle. Let us stop a moment at the picture. The first thing which overpowers the imagination, and we may indeed say also the understanding, is the diminution of the masses, then the loss of ground, which takes place always, more or less, and therefore on the side of the assailant also, if he is not fortunate. Then the rupture of the original formation, the jumbling together of the troops, the risks of retreat, which, with few exceptions, may always be seen sometimes in a less, sometimes in a greater degree. Next the retreat, the most part of which commences at night, or, at least, goes on throughout the night. On this first march we must at once leave behind a number of men completely worn out and scattered about, often just the bravest, who have been foremost in the fight, who have held out the longest. The feeling of being conquered, which only sees the superior officers on the battlefield, now spreads through all ranks, even down to the common soldiers, aggravated by the horrible idea of being obliged to leave in the enemy's hands so many brave comrades, who but a moment since were of such value to us in the battle, and aggravated by a rising distrust of the chief, to whom, more or less, every subordinate attributes as a fault the fruitless efforts he has made. And this feeling of being conquered is no ideal picture over which one might become master. It is an evident truth that the enemy is superior to us, a truth of which the causes might have been so latent before that they were not to be discovered, but which, in the issue, comes out clear and palpable, or which was also perhaps before suspected, but which, in the want of any certainty, we had to oppose by the hope of chance, reliance on good fortune, providence, or a bold attitude. Now all this has proved insufficient, and the bitter truth meets us harsh and imperious. All these feelings are widely different from a panic, which in an army fortified by military virtue never, and in any other only exceptionally, follows the loss of a battle. They must arise even in the best of armies, and although long habituation to war and victory together, with great confidence in a commander, may modify them a little here and there, they are never entirely wanting in the first moment. They are not the pure consequences of lost trophies. They are usually lost at a later period, and the loss of them does not become generally known so quickly. They will therefore not fail to appear even when the scale turns in the slowest and most gradual manner, and they constitute that effect of a victory upon which we can always count in every case. We have already said that the number of trophies intensifies this effect. It is evident that an army in this condition, looked at as an instrument, is weakened. How can we expect that when reduced to such a degree that, as we said before, it finds new enemies in all the ordinary difficulties of making war, it will be able to recover by fresh efforts what has been lost? Before the battle there was a real or assumed equilibrium between the two sides. This is lost, and therefore some external assistance is requisite to restore it. Every new effort without such external support can only lead to fresh losses. Thus, therefore, the most moderate victory of the chief Army must tend to cause a constant sinking of the scale on the opponent's side, until new external circumstances bring about a change. If these are not near, if the conqueror is an eager opponent who, thirsting for glory, pursues great aims, then a first-rate commander, and in the beaten Army a true military spirit, hardened by many campaigns, are required, in order to stop the swollen stream of prosperity from bursting all bounds, and to moderate its course by small but reiterated acts of resistance, until the force of victory has spent itself at the goal of its career. And now as to the effect of defeat beyond the Army upon the nation and government. It is the sudden collapse of hopes stretched to the utmost, the downfall of all self-reliance. In place of these extinct forces, fear, with its destructive properties of expansion, rushes into the vacuum left, and completes the prostration. It is a very real shock upon the nerves, which one of the two athletes receives from the electric spark of victory. And that effect, however different in degrees, is never completely wanting. Instead of everyone hastening with a spirit of determination to aid in repairing the disaster, everyone fears that his efforts will only be in vain, and stops, hesitating with himself, when he should rush forward, or, in despondency, he lets his arm drop, leaving everything to fate. The consequence which this effect of victory brings forth in the course of the war itself depend in part on the character and talent of the victorious General, but more on the circumstances from which the victory proceeds, and to which it leads. Without boldness and an enterprising spirit on the part of the leader, the most brilliant victory will lead to no great success, and its force exhausts itself all the sooner on circumstances if these offer a strong and stubborn opposition to it. How very different from Daun Frederick the Great would have used the victory at Kollin, and what different consequences France, in place of Prussia, might have given a battle of Leuthen. The conditions which allow us to expect great results from a great victory we shall learn when we come to the subjects with which they are connected. Then it will be possible to explain the disproportion which appears at first sight between the magnitude of the victory and its results, and which is only too readily attributed to a want of energy on the part of the conqueror. Here, where we have to do with the great battle in itself, we shall merely say that the effects now depicted never fail to attend a victory, that they mount up with the intensive strength of the victory, mount up the more the whole strength of the Army has been concentrated in it, the more the whole military power of the nation is contained in that Army, and the State in that military power. But then the question may be asked, can theory accept this effect of victory as absolutely necessary? Must it not rather endeavour to find out counteracting means capable of neutralising these effects? It seems quite natural to answer this question in the affirmative, but Heaven defend us from taking that wrong course of most theorists, out of which is begotten a mutually devouring pro et contra. Certainly that effect is perfectly necessary, for it has its foundation in the nature of things, and it exists, even if we find a means to struggle against it. Just as the motion of a cannon ball is always in the direction of the terrestrial, although when fired from east to west, part of the general velocity is destroyed by this opposite motion. All war supposes human weakness, and against that it is directed. Therefore, if hereafter in another place we examine what is to be done after the loss of a great battle, if we bring under review the resources which still remain, even in the most desperate cases, if we should express a belief in the possibility of retrieving all, even in such a case it must not be supposed we mean thereby that the effects of such a defeat can, by degrees, be completely wiped out, for the forces and means used to repair the disaster might have been applied to the realisation of some positive object, and this applies both to the moral and physical forces. Another question is, whether through the loss of a great battle, forces are not perhaps roused into existence, which otherwise would never have come to life. This case is certainly conceivable, and it is what has actually occurred with many nations. But to produce this intensified reaction is beyond the province of military art, which can only take account of it where it might be assumed as a possibility. If there are cases in which the fruits of a victory appear rather of a destructive nature, in consequence of the reaction of the forces which it had the effect of rousing into activity, cases which certainly are very exceptional, then it must the more surely be granted that there is a difference in the effects which one and the same victory may produce according to the character of the people or state which has been conquered. End of Book 4, Chapter 10. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia.